a desperate homeless boy, a billionaire unaware of the danger in front of him, and a woman hiding a deadly secret. Today, a single decision will change everything. Will he listen? Will the truth come out before it's too late? This is the story of betrayal, survival, and an unexpected act of courage that no one saw coming. Stay tuned, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Don't forget to leave a comment sharing your thoughts and subscribe to the channel to stay updated with our latest videos, because the truth deserves to be told. Aurora Bistro was a beacon of luxury, a haven for the city's elite. Nestled between high-rise buildings and designer boutiques, the restaurant was known for its world-class cuisine and its strict exclusivity. With its towering glass windows, golden chandeliers, and marble flooring, the establishment oozed wealth and refinement. The soft hum of classical music played in the background, blending seamlessly with the gentle clinking of silverware against porcelain plates. For the rich and powerful, Aurora Bistro was more than just a restaurant. It was a status symbol. Deals worth millions were made over perfectly aged wine, affairs whispered about over imported caviar, and power struggles masked by polite conversation. It was a world where appearances were everything. At the center of it all sat Jonathan Hayes, a man whose wealth and influence were the stuff of legends. At 68, he was still a formidable presence, his sharp blue eyes scanning the room with the precision of a man who had spent a lifetime making high-stakes decisions. His face bore the lines of time and experience, but his posture remained upright, his aura one of quiet dominance. His tailored charcoal gray suit, handcrafted in Italy, sat flawlessly on his broad frame. His Rolex gleamed subtly under the dim lights, a silent testament to his vast empire. Across from him sat Vanessa, his much younger wife. She was breathtakingly beautiful, the kind of woman who turned heads effortlessly. Her raven-black hair was styled in soft waves, cascading over one shoulder like silk. Her lips, painted a deep crimson, curled into a delicate smile as she gazed at her husband. She was the perfect image of a doting wife, elegant, attentive, and poised. But beneath the surface, something darker lurked. Vanessa had perfected her role well over the years. She knew exactly when to laugh at Jonathan's dry humor, when to reach across the table to touch his hand, when to lower her gaze just enough to appear demure. But the truth was, her devotion was nothing more than a carefully crafted performance. She was tired of the suffocating presence of a man who controlled every aspect of her life. Tired of being a trophy wife paraded around at business galas and charity events. Tired of waiting, but waiting was over. Tonight her patience would finally pay off. She reached for her purse, her fingers brushing against the cool glass of a small vial hidden inside. Her heart pounded, but outwardly her expression remained unchanged. Slowly she withdrew the vial and with practiced ease twisted the cap open. The liquid inside was clear, odorless, undetectable. A single drop was all it took. Outside the restaurant, Darren, a 14-year-old homeless boy, pressed his face against the glass window. His stomach growled, a painful reminder of how long it had been since his last meal. His hoodie, too large for his thin frame, barely shielded him from the night's chill. He had learned to ignore the stares of the wealthy patrons, the way they looked through him as if he were invisible. It was nothing new. He didn't belong here. Darren's life had been a series of disappointments, each one pushing him further toward the edges of society. He had once had a home, a family, but life had been cruel. His mother, a single parent, had fallen into financial ruin. With no safety net, they had lost everything, first the apartment, then the car, then each other. She had promised to come back for him. She never did. For months, he had wandered from shelter to shelter, learning to survive in a world that did not care whether he lived or died. He had stolen food when necessary, endured cold nights on park benches, and avoided the dangers of the streets. But tonight, as he stood outside Aurora Bistro, he saw something that made his blood run cold. His eyes were drawn to the couple seated near the window. The older man seemed important. His suit alone looked like it cost more than anything Darren had ever owned. But it wasn't the man who caught his attention. It was the woman. Darren watched as Vanessa pulled out the vial, tilted it slightly, and let the liquid drip into the man's glass of water. His breath hitched. For a moment he thought he had imagined it. But no, the way she stirred the water casually, the way her fingers trembled ever so slightly, the way she stole a glance at the man as he remained oblivious. This was real. Something was very, very wrong. His instincts screamed at him to walk away. This wasn't his problem. What did he care if a rich man was in danger? The wealthy had never cared about him. If he stepped in, who would believe him? A homeless kid barging into an expensive restaurant, accusing a well-dressed woman of trying to poison her husband. They'd laugh at him, throw him out before he even got a word in. But something about the scene before him gnawed at his conscience. The man had no idea what was about to happen. Darren imagined himself sitting there, trusting someone he thought loved him, only to have them betray him so cruelly. The thought made his stomach turn. He glanced back at the water. The man's hand was moving toward the glass. His time to act was slipping away. Darren clenched his fists. If he did nothing, this man might die. But if he spoke up, he might get arrested, or worse, ignored. He had been invisible his whole life. But tonight he would make them see him. Taking a deep breath, Darren stepped away from the window and toward the entrance. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. The doorman, dressed in a black suit, barely spared him a glance before blocking his path. "You can't be in here," the man said sharply, his gaze dropping to Darren's ragged clothes. But Darren didn't care. He had to get to that table. He pushed past the doorman and darted inside, his voice breaking through the elegant, subdued atmosphere of the restaurant. "Don't drink that." The words echoed, silencing the room. The clatter of silverware ceased. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. Every eye in the restaurant turned toward the source of the commotion. At the table, Jonathan froze, his glass just inches from his lips. His sharp gaze locked onto the boy, confusion and irritation flickering across his face. Across from him, Vanessa stiffened, her hand gripping the table's edge. Her expression, a perfect mask of shock, concealed the panic rising in her chest. Darren's breath came in short gasps. He had done it. But what happened next, he had no idea. Here is the fully expanded Chapter 2, a bold decision, reaching approximately 1,000 words. For Jonathan Hayes, distractions were a necessary evil. The world never stopped moving, and neither could he. Even during a quiet dinner with his wife at Aurora Bistro, his phone remained an extension of his mind. An endless stream of emails, financial reports, and stock market updates. He had long since perfected the art of balancing conversation with Vanessa while tending to his empire in the background. So when she nudged his glass of water slightly closer to him, he barely noticed. Vanessa's expression was serene, her painted lips curving into a soft smile. "You should drink something," she murmured. "You've barely touched your water." Her voice was smooth, inviting, almost affectionate. It was the voice of a woman who cared, or at least pretended to. Jonathan absent-mindedly reached for the glass, his fingers brushing against the cool condensation on the surface. He was still scrolling through a market report, barely registering Vanessa's words. She watched him carefully, her fingers gripping the stem of her wine glass with slightly more force than necessary. Across the restaurant, nestled against the large glass window, Darren's pulse raced. His instincts screamed at him to run, to disappear into the shadows where he had spent the last few months surviving. But his gut told him otherwise. He had seen her, Vanessa, pour something into the water. He knew without a doubt that it was not meant to be harmless. His breath came in shallow gasps. He could already picture it, the man sipping his drink, his throat tightening, his body convulsing as the poison coursed through his system. By the time anyone realized what had happened, it would be too late. He couldn't let that happen. But what could he do? He was just a street kid. No one would believe him. People barely acknowledged his existence when he asked for spare change, let alone if he accused a wealthy, well-dressed woman of attempted murder. The uncertainty nearly paralyzed him. But then he saw it. Jonathan was lifting the glass to his lips. Everything inside Darren screamed. He had only seconds to act. With a deep breath, he shoved the fear aside and slammed his palm against the glass window of the restaurant. "Don't drink that." The words cut through the restaurant like a knife. A wave of silence crashed over Aurora Bistro. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Forks clattered onto plates. Eyes snapped toward the source of the voice, toward him. Darren felt every single gaze lock onto him, but he couldn't stop now. His chest heaved as he pointed directly at Jonathan's glass. "Don't drink that. She put something in it. I saw her." Jonathan froze. His glass hovered mere inches from his lips, confusion flickering across his face. Vanessa, on the other hand, acted instantly. Her expression twisted into one of outrage and disbelief, her eyes widening in feigned shock. She turned toward the window, her face painted with just the right amount of horror and exasperation. "Who let him in here?" she demanded, her voice sharp with controlled fury. "He's just some street rat trying to cause trouble." The entire restaurant held its breath, eyes darting between the well-dressed woman and the ragged boy standing outside the glass. Jonathan's brow furrowed. His gaze drifted to the boy outside, then back to Vanessa. A strange, uneasy feeling settled in his chest. Darren clenched his fists. He could already feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on him. He was filthy, out of place, an unwelcome intruder in this world of silk dresses and polished shoes. But he had to make them listen. His voice cracked as he pressed forward, his words tumbling out in desperation. "I saw her. She took something out of her purse and poured it into your water. It wasn't normal. It disappeared right away." A murmur rippled through the room. The watching diners exchanged glances, some whispering under their breath. Jonathan's grip on the glass tightened. His mind, conditioned to weigh facts and discard nonsense, struggled with the absurdity of the situation. He had encountered scams, manipulations, people trying to deceive him for years. Was this just another ploy? Vanessa sighed dramatically, her shoulders slumping as if exhausted by the sheer ridiculousness of it all. "This is absurd," she scoffed, shaking her head. "He's making up lies just to get attention. You know how these street kids are, always looking for a handout." Darren's stomach twisted. He knew this would happen. He had seen it before, adults with power turning the tables, making the truth seem like a fantasy. His voice rose, trembling but unwavering. "I don't want anything. I'm telling you the truth. If you drink that, you'll get sick, or worse." Jonathan hesitated, looking down at the untouched glass of water. Doubt crept in, inching its way into his carefully constructed logic. He had never been a man who entertained paranoia. He had built his empire on rationality, on facts. But something about this situation didn't sit right. The boy was desperate, but not in the way a con artist would be. He wasn't asking for money, wasn't begging for food. He wasn't trying to take anything from him. He was trying to stop him. Vanessa, sensing his hesitation, leaned in closer, her fingers brushing against his arm. "Jonathan," she said sweetly, too sweetly, "this is ridiculous. You're not actually going to believe this nonsense, are you?" Jonathan met her gaze. There was something off in her eyes. She was good, too good. She wasn't frantic, wasn't truly appalled. Instead, she was controlled, working her way through the situation, steering him toward her desired outcome. That unease grew. Darren saw the flicker of uncertainty cross Jonathan's face. He latched onto it, pushing forward with everything he had left. "If you don't believe me, fine," Darren said, voice shaking but firm. Call someone, have them test the water. You're rich, right? You have lawyers, doctors, people who can check it for you, but don't drink it. Just don't." The words hung in the air, heavier than before. A waiter hesitated near the back, unsure of what to do. The diners remained still, waiting for Jonathan's next move. Jonathan exhaled slowly, setting the glass back down. For the first time in the entire confrontation, Vanessa's mask cracked. It was subtle, a flash of panic in her eyes, a momentary tightening of her jaw. But Jonathan saw it. And suddenly, he wasn't so sure anymore. The silence inside Aurora Bistro was thick with tension, as if the entire restaurant was holding its breath. The hushed whispers of nearby diners buzzed like static in the background, but all eyes remained locked on the unfolding spectacle. Darren stood frozen just beyond the entrance, his small chest heaving from the rush of adrenaline. The doorman, momentarily stunned by the sudden disruption, was regaining his wits and stepping forward to remove the intruder. But before he could lay a hand on Darren, the boy took a bold step forward, slipping past him and marching directly toward Jonathan's table. He had nothing to lose. Jonathan Hayes sat stiffly, his piercing gaze trained on the boy, unreadable. The once calm billionaire was now wavering, his fingers still lingering near the untouched glass of water. His instincts warred against logic. He was used to spotting deception, but this was something else, something raw, unfiltered, and utterly unignorable. Vanessa, however, was done pretending. "Enough!" Her voice cut through the murmurs like a blade. Her chair screeched against the floor as she stood, fury radiating from her perfectly composed exterior. The genteel, graceful socialite was gone, replaced by a woman on the edge of unraveling. She turned her venomous gaze to Darren, eyes narrowing. "You little liar," she spat, her voice shaking with controlled rage. "Who paid you to do this? Is this some pathetic attempt at a scam? Are you hoping for money? A free meal?" Darren flinched at the accusation but didn't back down. He had been called worse in his life. "I don't want anything," he said, voice stronger now, unwavering despite the fear clawing at his insides. "I just want him," he pointed directly at Jonathan, "to know the truth." Jonathan's fingers tightened into a fist. He turned toward Vanessa slowly, his gaze sharpening. "What truth?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. Vanessa's lips curled into a humorless smile, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping the edge of the table. "That he's lying," she snapped, motioning toward Darren with barely concealed contempt. "He's just another street kid trying to stir up trouble." She turned back to her husband, her voice softening. "Jonathan," she said, reaching for his hand, "this is ridiculous. You can't seriously be entertaining this nonsense." Darren's heart pounded. He had come this far, but Vanessa was too good at this game. She knew exactly how to manipulate Jonathan, how to plant doubt, redirect blame, and maintain her facade. But Darren wasn't leaving without a fight. He took another step forward, his voice louder now, unwavering. "I saw you," he said directly to Vanessa, his eyes burning with conviction. "I saw you take that bottle out of your purse. I saw you pour something into his drink when he wasn't looking." Gasps rippled through the restaurant. More heads turned. Vanessa stiffened. Darren could tell for the first time she was nervous. "You're insane," she hissed, her voice lowering, but there was a flicker of fear in her expression now. "You're making this up. It's pathetic." Darren ignored her, turning back to Jonathan. "If you don't believe me," he said, his voice steady despite the pressure, "then have someone test it." He pointed at the untouched glass on the table. "You have money, right? Power. You can get a lab or a doctor or whoever rich people call to test it. Just don't drink it." "Please." Jonathan's jaw tightened. For the first time, Vanessa's confidence wavered. "Jonathan," she began, her voice strained, but he held up a hand, silencing her. His piercing gaze locked onto her face, studying every micro-expression, every twitch of discomfort. Then, without a word, he turned toward the nearest waiter. "Get the manager, now." A hush fell over the restaurant. The waiter, unsure but obedient, hurried away, disappearing toward the kitchen. The murmurs among the onlookers grew louder, their curiosity now full-blown intrigue. Vanessa paled. "Jonathan, you're not seriously," she started, but this time he didn't look at her. Instead, he stared at the glass of water, his thoughts a storm behind his usually controlled expression. Darren held his breath, waiting, hoping. For the first time, Vanessa looked trapped. For the first time, she knew she might lose. Aurora Bistro, once a symphony of quiet conversation and the clinking of fine silverware, had turned into a stage where an unscripted drama unfolded. The elegant, candle-lit ambience had become a battleground of whispered accusations, suspicion, and slowly crumbling facades. The weight of Darren's words still hung in the air like a heavy fog, thick with tension and disbelief. Jonathan, ever the rational businessman, had built his empire on cold, hard facts, on knowing when someone was lying, on reading between the lines of contracts and deals. Yet, at that moment, he wasn't sure what to believe. The glass of water still sat untouched on the table. The supposed poison within it remained a mystery, but the uncertainty it carried poisoned the very air around them. The waiter returned, his nervous hands clutching a notepad, eyes flickering between the billionaire and the young boy standing by his table. "Sir, the manager is on his way," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan nodded. His gaze flickered toward the glass again before finally landing on Vanessa. She was struggling to maintain her composure. The perfectly applied makeup, the poised demeanor, the subtle, calculated smiles, all beginning to crack. Her fingers tapped against the table with a measured rhythm, but the slight tremor in her hands betrayed her. She glanced around at the growing crowd of diners whose curiosity had turned into full-blown fascination. Some whispered behind their hands, others merely stared, waiting for the next move. Darren, emboldened by Jonathan's hesitation, refused to back down. "You don't want them to check it, do you?" Darren asked, his voice steady. "Because you know what they'll find." Vanessa whipped her head toward him, her eyes dark, lips pressed into a thin line. "You insolent little," she started, then caught herself, realizing her rising anger would only make things worse. She took a deep breath, forcing her lips into a brittle smile. "This is ridiculous," she scoffed, shaking her head. "I can't believe you're wasting everyone's time on this nonsense." Jonathan didn't respond. He was watching her closely now, his calculating gaze studying every micro-expression, every hesitation. Vanessa felt the walls closing in. The murmurs around them grew. The whispers turned into something more dangerous, judgment, speculation. Then the waiter hesitated, reaching toward the glass of water. Vanessa's pulse skyrocketed. If they tested it, if they found anything, her plan, her carefully crafted life would be over. She couldn't let that happen. Her breath came sharper, her chest rising and falling with increasing rapidity. The reality of her situation began clawing at her, peeling away the mask she had so carefully maintained. And then it happened. The pressure, the scrutiny, the way Jonathan wasn't defending her, it all collided at once, and something inside her snapped. Her voice, once velvety, smooth, and controlled, twisted into a venomous hiss. "I can't stand him anymore." The words burst from her lips, sharp and jagged. The restaurant fell into complete silence. Her chest heaved, her perfectly curated exterior shattered into pieces. "He wasn't supposed to make it past this year," she screamed, slamming her fist onto the table. The entire restaurant gasped in unison. Forks dropped. Glasses clinked. Some diners pulled out their phones, the glow of recording screens flickering like stars in the dimly lit restaurant. Jonathan's world stopped. For a long, painful moment, he could do nothing but stare. The words rang in his ears, deafening. He wasn't supposed to make it past this year. The weight of the revelation crushed him. Everything slowed. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. His mind raced through every moment, every sign he had ignored, every whisper of doubt that had ever crossed his thoughts about his wife. She had never truly loved him. It wasn't the anger that hit him first. It was the betrayal. The woman he had trusted, the woman he had shared his life and wealth with, had been plotting his death. Vanessa's chest rose and fell in rapid succession, as if even she couldn't believe she had said it out loud. The hush in the restaurant was suffocating. Darren stood firm, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had always known people like Vanessa existed, the kind who used wealth, power, and charm to manipulate their way to whatever they wanted. But seeing her crumble under the weight of her own scheme, it was almost satisfying. Jonathan finally found his voice, though it was much quieter than before. "You," he barely recognized his own voice. It sounded distant, detached, as if the words were coming from a stranger. "You were trying to kill me." Vanessa snapped her head toward him, her wide eyes filled with something unreadable: shock, rage, fear. She started, her lips parting slightly as though she wanted to take the words back, to pretend none of it had happened, but it was too late. She had said it. She had admitted it. She had admitted it. The reality of what she had done was out in the open now, and there was no smooth, carefully worded lie that could erase it. Jonathan, still shell-shocked, sat frozen as if willing himself to wake up from this nightmare. But he knew. This wasn't a nightmare. This was real. And the woman he thought he knew had just destroyed everything. The hushed murmurs inside Aurora Bistro turned into an urgent buzz of whispers as flashing red and blue lights cast long, flickering shadows against the pristine walls of the restaurant. The police had arrived. A pair of uniformed officers pushed through the stunned crowd, their eyes sweeping the room with sharp efficiency. The lead officer, Detective Paul Reed, a man in his mid-40s with a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped forward, his gaze locking onto Jonathan Hayes, who still sat motionless, the weight of betrayal pressing heavily against his chest. "Sir," Reed said, his voice cutting through the tension, "we received multiple calls about a possible attempted poisoning. Can you confirm what happened?" Before Jonathan could respond, Vanessa jerked to her feet. "This is ridiculous," she shrieked, her face contorted with fury and desperation. "My husband, he'll vouch for me. This is just a misunderstanding." Her voice cracked as she spoke, the carefully controlled poise she had maintained for years now completely shattered. Jonathan turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Vanessa," he said, his voice low, almost distant. "You said it yourself." She froze. Jonathan's voice hardened as he repeated her damning confession, loud enough for everyone to hear. He wasn't supposed to make it past this year. A gasp rippled through the onlookers. Some recorded the exchange, capturing every moment on their phones. Detective Reed's sharp gaze snapped to Vanessa. "Is that true, ma'am?" he asked coolly. "No," she blurted, shaking her head frantically. "He's twisting my words. I was just angry. You can't arrest me for that." But her panic betrayed her. She made a sudden move, trying to dart around the officers toward the door. She never made it. One of the officers grabbed her just in time, twisting her arms behind her back. "Let go of me," she screeched, struggling against their hold. Her designer bracelet clattered onto the floor as she thrashed wildly, but the officers were unmoved. "You have the right to remain silent," the officer restraining her said, his tone calm but firm. As the familiar click of handcuffs echoed through the restaurant, Vanessa's breath came in sharp gasps, her reality crashing down upon her. She had lost. She turned her gaze toward Jonathan, pleading, desperate, her emerald green eyes once mesmerizing, now filled with nothing but fear. "Jonathan," she whimpered, her voice trembling, "please tell them. You know I love you." Jonathan's stomach twisted. The woman he had trusted, the woman he had once believed loved him, had plotted his death. And now, faced with the consequences, she begged for his mercy. He said nothing. With one final agonized scream, Vanessa was dragged away, her voice fading as the restaurant doors swung shut behind her. And then there was silence. A long, exhausted silence. Jonathan let out a slow breath, rubbing his temples. He could feel the eyes of the entire restaurant on him, waiting to see his reaction, but he didn't care. Instead, his gaze shifted to Darren. The boy stood completely still, his posture tense as if expecting to be shoved out of the restaurant at any second. His shoulders were hunched, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his tattered hoodie, a boy who was used to being ignored, dismissed, or cast aside. Jonathan exhaled slowly. It hit him all at once. If Darren hadn't been there, hadn't seen what Vanessa had done, hadn't spoken up despite every reason not to, Jonathan would be dead. This kid had saved his life. He pushed his chair back and stood, the weight of the night still pressing down on him. Then slowly, he extended his hand toward Darren. "You saved my life." Jonathan's voice was quieter now, raw with something he wasn't used to showing, gratitude. Darren shifted uneasily. I couldn't let it happen," he muttered, his voice hesitant. Jonathan studied him carefully. There was no hint of greed in his expression, no expectation of a reward. Just a boy who had chosen to do the right thing, despite the fact that the world had never been kind to him. Jonathan frowned slightly, noticing something he hadn't before. Darren was too thin. His hoodie hung loosely on his small frame, his jeans torn, his sneakers barely holding together. And then it clicked. "You're homeless," Jonathan murmured. It wasn't a question. Darren stiffened. He took a step back, his guard immediately rising. "I don't need anything," he said quickly. "I'm not asking for money or—" Jonathan held up a hand, silencing him. "You didn't do this for a reward," he said, his voice firmer now, more certain. "And that's exactly why I want to help you." Darren hesitated, his dark eyes searching Jonathan's face. He had spent so long fending for himself, so long expecting rejection, that the idea of someone actually wanting to help him without an ulterior motive felt foreign. "I don't want charity," Darren said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan shook his head. "This isn't charity," he corrected. "It's me repaying a debt." Darren blinked. Jonathan turned toward the waiter. "Get my driver," he instructed. "Tell him we have a guest tonight." Darren's head snapped up. "Wait, what?" Jonathan gave the boy a small, genuine smile. "You're coming with me," he said simply. "I'll get you a place to stay, a safe place." Darren swallowed hard. No one had ever said those words to him before. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't dared to believe in for a long time. Hope. He hesitated for only a moment longer before finally nodding. And as they walked out of Aurora Bistro, leaving behind the chaos and betrayal of the night, Darren knew that this was the beginning of something new. Something better. Lesson for the audience: this story is more than just a dramatic encounter between wealth, betrayal, and justice. It carries powerful lessons that resonate far beyond the walls of Aurora Bistro. Courage comes in all forms. Darren had every reason to stay silent. The world had taught him that no one listens to kids like him, let alone a homeless boy. But despite his fear of being ignored or ridiculed, he chose to speak up. Doing the right thing isn't always easy, but true courage is standing up for what's right, even when the odds are against you. The truth always comes out. Vanessa thought she was untouchable, that her carefully crafted lies and manipulations would keep her safe. But in the end, the truth found a way to reveal itself. Lies may offer temporary power, but they always crumble under the weight of justice. Judgment based on appearance is dangerous. If Jonathan had dismissed Darren as just another street kid without listening, he would have been dead by morning. This is a lesson for all of us. Never judge someone by their status wealth, or appearance. Sometimes, the people we overlook are the ones who can change our lives. Kindness can change a life. Darren wasn't looking for a reward. He only wanted to save a life. But because of his bravery, his own life changed forever. One act of kindness, one moment of selflessness, can open doors to a future you never imagined. Justice must be served. Vanessa thought her wealth and position would protect her, but no one is above accountability. Whether rich or poor, powerful or powerless, people must be held responsible for their actions. At the end of the day, this story reminds us that morality isn't defined by wealth or status. It's defined by the choices we make when no one else is watching. Even the smallest voice can make the biggest difference. So the next time you see something wrong, will you speak up?